Okay, y'all, I'm going to try this one more time and we'll see what happens here. Give me one moment.
I think we're live.
If
I think we're
live.
live.
All right, well, that's good. Thank you, Danae. All right, we'll go and get started. Sorry, everyone, for the delays and the technical difficulties here, but this is live live Zoom broadcasts, live Facebook broadcasts. So thank you, everyone, for joining us here for the third installment of our virtual folk and traditional arts roundtable from Texas Folklife. Thank you to all our panelists for being here and being patient with us as we get the tech side figured out. We are learning as we go and hopefully can learn from each other in the whole process. I wanted to, again, remind everyone that this is part of a weekly series that Texas Folklife is trying to do to address various issues related to folk and traditional arts here in our region in Texas and beyond, and other issues related to the COVID-19 pandemic and how we as traditional arts organizations or people that study folk and traditional arts or work in storytelling and other forms of expression, cultural expression, are responding to the times and continuing our work. So we have a great conversation set up for this evening, and wanted to extend a welcome to all of our panelists here. So I'm going to introduce them overall, and then we will go through, each one of them will have a chance to talk about some of their work, and then we'll end with a little Q&A discussion at the end. So I'd like to welcome here from the International Storytelling Center, the president, Kiran Singh Sirah. So welcome, Kiran. Also like to say hello to Cecelia Ottenweller, who has a MA in Cultural Sustainability from Goucher College and is in Houston, the Houston area. Welcome, Cecelia. Say hello to Danae Johnson, who is the Texas Folklife Stories from Deep in the Heart program director with us this evening. And Jane Field, who is the Associate Director of the Texas After Violence Project. So hello, everyone. Welcome to you all. Thank you for bearing with us here on the delays, but we got this off the ground. So I'm going to allow each panelist to talk for about 10 minutes about their work. The theme that we're centering our discussion around tonight is the power of stories and storytelling. So the prompt that I've had the panelists kind of address here tonight is as follows. How can storytelling help us through these challenging times? And what's at stake in providing platforms for stories and amplifying voices during this moment? Our panel will discuss examples, developments, strategies around storytelling as it relates to their work and the current global health pandemic we are in. So I'm going to allow Kiran to kick us off here. I'm going to give brief introductions of all of our panelists so our audience can understand who they are and where they're coming from. So Kiran is the president of the International Storytelling Center based in Jonesboro, Tennessee. And I'm just going to read a little bit of his bio because he's very accomplished and does a lot of great work, but this might kind of set the tone for the conversation. He's a long way from his native England. His parents and older brother, then just a babe in arms, arrived there as refugees in 1972 as they fled from Uganda at gunpoint as part of the ethnic cleansing regime of then dictator Idi Amin. The only things they could take with them were their stories, and these they had in abundance. Although he was born in the UK, these stories of his heritage were a strong part of his upbringing. His mother was from Kenya, his father was born in India, and his brother was born in Uganda. My own family is a mini United Nations, he quips. The stories shared helped him find a sense of identity and belonging and served to instill in him courage, determination, and perseverance. So I'd like to give the floor to Kiran and like to welcome you. Thank you so much for joining us. Kiran, please take it away.
I'm unmuted there, right? Thanks so much, Charlie, for the introduction, and thanks. It's great I really enjoyed the intro music. I was listening to the tabla because I used to play the tabla as a kid, and I love to hear that fusion. So yeah, I am here right now on my couch in East Tennessee, just to give you a little bit of I know it's confusing because my accent doesn't sound very Appalachian. It's actually a North Carolinian, just kidding. But anyway, I'm based in East Tennessee. and I run the International Storytelling Center. I don't have the center with me, but I have a cup. International Storytelling Center. And it's based in Jonesboro, Tennessee's oldest town, and it's a beautiful town, and it's where we host the big event, the National Storytelling Festival, which started in 1973. So I probably, Charlie did a really good job of kind of laying that kind of background to why stories matter to me. And I might kind of go a little bit into that story, but just tell you a little bit first about what I do right now as a center, and what we do as I do in my job running the International Storytelling Center. So the center is about 14,000 square foot state-of-the-art facility. But our origins really began when my predecessor, Mr. Jimmy Neal Smith, came up with an idea to create a national storytelling festival in 1973. And he particularly did that to save a dying mountain town, an Appalachian town, which then led to inviting a mountain man storyteller, Mr. Ray Higgs from North Carolina, from Beech Mountain. And then others came. And what happened in 1973 is that these storytellers that came were storytellers that were performing there potentially at folk festivals across the country. And what came out of that was a place where just storytellers themselves could have a place of their own, a festival of their own. And that became known as the National Storytelling Festival. What started in 1973 with around 60 to 80 people sitting on hay bales on a flatbed truck in a small Appalachian town is now around 10,500 people that meet every October. And it's become, the world's largest storytelling festival of its kind. It's about a 3-day event. And we bring storytellers from all over the country. And Texas has a wonderful storytelling community, and the Texas Storytelling Festival that takes place in Texas is one of the best in the nation. So I would say our focus, one way to think about the work that we do is through 3 Ps, preservation, performance, and practice. Preservation in terms of the preservation of stories are so important. The performance is because we really emphasize the performative storytelling, the oral tradition, the artist storyteller, but also practice. And that is what I'll come talk a bit more about, because that's kind of almost my entryway into the storytelling world. Practice as in terms of the application of storytelling in things like peace building, social justice, community building, community development, and healthcare. Now, Charlie talked a little bit about my background, about my parents. And I was talking today, actually, to Mama Linda Goss. Mama Linda Goss is the founder of the National Association of Black Storytellers. And she is an elder, and she received the National Endowment for the Arts National Heritage Fellowship last year. And we were talking about our ancestry. She just phoned me up out of the blue. She lives in Baltimore now, but she's originally from Tennessee, from these mountains. And we started talking about our heritage, our ancestors, the stories that have informed who we are. And I started to talk about my parents, both my mum and dad, and the places that they had been and what they passed on to me. And she described my parents as kind of like a lion and a rock. My mother was the lion and my father was the rock. But when they left Uganda in 1972, they came to Britain. They came to Britain with just the shirts on their back. They were robbed from all of their possessions. They left the equator, but they arrived in the middle of Britain in the middle of a British winter. And there was also a lot of anti-immigrant sentiment going on at that time. Some of the planes had to divert because they were stormed. The airports were stormed by neo-Nazis. But they eventually arrived and settled in a small town in South England, which was the place that I was born 4 years later. Now, growing up as a kid, as a young child, in a place when it felt like there was a lot of violence, a lot of confusion, a lot of chaos, a lot of personal crisis. My earliest crisis was when I was 5 years old and I was knocked off my bicycle by a neo-Nazi and I ended up with 26 stitches on my face. And I remember that. And I remember other crises. I remember the chaos of a world that I didn't quite understand. And when I was bullied in the playground, or called smelly immigrant or curry boy, or these words that are derogatory, much worse words than that, I would run home to my mother, and my mother would be I remember her standing at the front door, and she was also a nurse, so she'd wear the white outfit and the upside down watch. I always remember that. And she would tell me stories about where I'd come from. And she told me stories of my grandfather, of my grandparents, of life in East Africa, the walk to school every day, how they would sit in the back garden and eat mango, the tropical fruits, and after the tropical rain, that would happen every day. She told me stories of my grandparents as freedom fighters, as people that were simple. They were farmers, they were carpenters, they were engineers, but they took on the world's largest empire and defeated them and freed 1 billion people. And she told me these stories that informed who I was. And she says, go back into that playground and tell them who you are. And so it's this idea that people can take away your houses, your possessions, your belongings, but one thing that no one can ever take away from you are your stories. And stories is the thing that helps to inform our identity. And when we understand our stories, we not only help to make sense of a world, but we can use them to build resilience. And I'm not going to speak for 10 minutes. I want to kind of just focus in on that because I think that's really important for right now. I've been last few weeks, I say that, we do these big events year round, and we're grappling with the ideas about how we present that work. But one of the things I've been focusing on personally is because my background is in using storytelling in conflict resolution in communities where there's been war or conflict or distress, or people coming out of a 30-year war, like in Northern Ireland, we use the storytelling process. And I realized there was a lot I could apply to that over here in a way that, so we've been developing a series of programs called Stories as Medicine, or trauma-informed storytelling, and particularly creating opportunities in which healthcare workers and care workers and medical staff, ER, in a particular hospital, are working with us to examine how stories themselves can be harnessed for their own strength and building resilience, but how they can use those stories, particularly in situations where they are grappling with the emotions of crisis themselves. They're on the front lines of a crisis, but they're going through all the emotions of fear of the unknown, not being able to have contact with their family, their children, their spouses. And so I wanted to kind of create a program in which they could learn how to harness their stories of resilience from their upbringing, just like my mother taught me, where the stories they can draw from to build personal strength, comfort, a sense of home, and use that to harness going forward. And it's a bit like, when you get on a plane and you're told in case of emergency, an oxygen mask will come down from the ceiling, put it to your face first. And they do that because if you can protect yourself, then you're better to protect others. But the same applies for storytelling. What story is coming up for you? How are you processing this moment? And if you can build your personal strength and resilience and through your own story, then you're going to be better equipped to help others around you. So that's a kind of overview of the work going on right now. And it's we call it applied storytelling, but really to think back, when we listen to a story from a 40,000-year-old civilization, when we listen to stories from tradition bearers, to people that have been passing on these stories for thousands of years, embedded in each story is wisdom, ideas, lessons, stories of resilience, stories of survival. So in a sense, stories has been medicine for a long, long time. It's not a new concept. And a man I met last year for dinner in New York City was from Sierra Leone, lived in this country for 30 years. So that in his village in Sierra Leone, the word for medicine is story. And I think that's the same for many cultures around the world. So I'll just end it there. And I really appreciate being here, being with you all. And thank you for listening.
Great. Thank you so much, Kiran.
Welcome.
Appreciate you sharing all of that. We're going to move to the next presenter, and that's going to be Cecelia Ottenweller. As I said, Cecelia has a MA in Cultural Sustainability from Goucher College. She's based in the Houston area, and recently she's done some ethnographic projects looking at how culture is impacting maternal health outcomes in Harris County. And she's going to talk a bit about that research and upcoming plans for that. So I'll turn it over to Cecelia. Take it away.
Thank you, Charlie. I really appreciate being asked to be part of this panel. This is really exciting for me. And I'm very happy to meet everybody who's on the panel with me. And I'm excited to be talking about my project. Before I launch into it, I did create some visuals for it. So, training going to school. But storytelling is absolutely an essential part of my life. Before I got into my master's program, I was actually the president of the Houston History Alliance here in Houston. And the programs that we put on here were all focused on using story as a method to challenge the single story of Houston. Quite often, large communities have a single story about how that community works, who are the key members, who are the key groups. And a lot of our programming challenged that and tried to provide opportunities for groups that don't often get the spotlight to come out and actually tell their portion of the story. And that was a very exciting part of my life. So my project is actually looking at medicine. And one of the reasons why I decided to look at this is because I have a medical background where I was raised in a medical family, but also in my adult life, I've dealt with breast cancer a couple of times. And that gave me a really powerful perspective, a lot of compassion and empathy for what people who are going through a disease process are actually living through, not just externally, but internally. So that's what inspired a great deal of why I did this project. I'm going to share my screen real quick and then take you through some of these visuals, and I hope I don't put anybody to sleep. So Charlie, hit the buzzer or the hook if I do, okay? So here we go. I'll put this in display mode. Let's see, can she work technology? Come on. Yay. So obviously I am talking about pregnancy. I am an independent ethnographer here working in Houston. This is not something that I'm doing right now purely professionally, although it would be nice. If anybody wants to hire me, let Charlie know. So this is all for my Master of Art in Cultural Sustainability at Goucher College. So if you're interested in that, go look it up. So next slide. So before we get started, I've got a few questions I want you all to consider. You keep this all to yourselves, or not for sharing for anybody, but keep them in your head. So first, besides COVID-19, what disease are you the most afraid of getting? What is it that when you wake up at 3 o'clock in the morning kind of haunts your thoughts? Okay. Next question is, who gets this disease? When you think about it, don't think too much about it, just off the top of your head. If you have a picture comes up in your head, who is it that gets this disease? The next question, why do they get this disease? Why do they have this problem? What is it that you are doing to make sure that you don't get this disease? Okay, so what I just did is I took you through some storytelling. You just told yourself a story, and that story was in part about who is the other. In a very quick experiment there, you actually identified in one way or another an other, somebody who is not you. So people think that stories are shaped by people. You might think that the story that you just told yourself about that particular disease is something that you created. That is not how it worked. In reality, stories shape people. It's the other way around. This quote is from one of my absolute favorite authors. This is Sir Terry Pratchett in his book, Witches Abroad. So this is it's something that when I first read it, it absolutely struck me up beside the head, because I've been living in a culture that taught me that all the stories that I'm teaching myself are things that I have deliberately picked up, that they're there in the environment, and I pick them up like if I go dewberry picking. It's my choice. But in the reality, it's something that I was given when I was born. So I found a really great metaphor for that. This is called the mycorrhizae layer, okay? So under every forest is something called a mycorrhizae layer. Above ground, a forest looks like it's independent trees, but it's not. Deep below in the world of the roots, a vast network exists, and that network consists of not just the roots, but also a fungal layer, okay? The layer connects everything below. And through the mycorrhizae, all of the growing things are sharing vital nutrients, such as water, nitrogen, and sugar. They're actually sharing the vital nutrients that helps them grow. Okay. So human culture is like that layer. We look like individuals, and once we're born, we're automatically connected to one another through this vast network. And we exchange the vital nutrients of belonging and connection and shared histories and shared understandings, exactly what Kiran was talking about. But we also share other things, and sometimes it's the darker parts. Humans are connected. We can't survive on our own. It's not possible for us. We're a social species, and through our social connections, we learn how to be human and how to survive. So what I'm looking at is, what stories are we telling about mothers? Getting a little bit more particular, what stories are we telling about Black mothers? And in the meantime, while we're looking at those stories, we're also looking at what stories we're telling about the practice of medicine and power. And that brings us to some statistics. So very quickly, here are the numbers. The United States and the developed countries is in a very poor position. We are at the very bottom of all the developed countries when it comes to maternal health, kind of grossly. And then this is looking at Texas. So the dotted line here is the overall numbers between 2005 and 2014. The gray line is Hispanics. Of course, these are census terms. The blue line are whites. And up here, the orange line is African Americans between 2005 and 2014. So let's get even more local. I live in Houston. Let's look at Harris County. So first of all, between 2007 and 2015, across all ethnicities, Texas' severe maternal morbidity rates, which is having some kind of debilitating illness in 1 year following pregnancy, increased 15%. In Harris County, they increased 53% in the same time period. And in many of the zip codes affected, African-American women are 3 to 5 times more likely to be affected. Why? It comes down to stories. So I'm looking at what stories are we telling about mothers? And this project was conducted between May and November of 2019. I interviewed 11 people, did 15 hours of interviews, transcribed them all. And then I worked together with a community group for the Preserving Communities of Color organization. They have a national conference here in Houston once a year. And our community group co-programmed an entire day on looking at health equity. And our morning session was looking at maternal health, and we used excerpts from my ethnographies to actually prompt the panel. As opposed to just coming up with questions, we used their stories in order to prompt the panel and talk to us about, from their professional opinion, what was actually going on. So I'm going to share with you some of those stories. This is a story from a Black practitioner. This is from her perspective. Charlotte is a midwife, and she's talking about a 30-year career and what it's been like to hear stories from the medical establishment, from the academy, about why people were getting diseases. And the essence is the patient, blaming the patient. She's too fat, too thin, too Black, problematic. Can you imagine every conference you go to for 30 years and they put up slides and every single thing that is bad or negative in healthcare is Black or African American? And that's her experience. How does this look when you're looking at mothers? This is Carol. She's talking about how she was viewed as a statistic. She had 5 children. She had her first child when she was 16 years old. So she has 5 kids, and men are like, oh, she's an easy smash. Women are like, oh, she's a hoe. And the professionals are like, oh my gosh, she must get a ton of food stamps and welfare. And that's the motive. And that's the story that she told me. The next story she told me after telling me this was actually being in a grocery store, and a medical professional walked up to her in his scrubs, a white guy, with his tag, who looked down at her cart with all of her cereal in it and made a comment about how she needed to have another hobby besides having sex. Then from non-Black doctors, one of the things that you need to know is that all the non-Black doctors that I talked to from my project were dedicated doctors that were working in nonprofit settings. They were doing everything they possibly could to make sure that everybody had access to the best care possible. But even in their stories, it was possible to see the poison of systemic racism running in the background. This quote is from Becca, and she's describing a system that was set up to create obstacles. And this is how privilege creates advantages. Those in the know can manage the system or find back doors, and those without privilege are cut off from vital life-saving resources, just like what's happening in the mycorrhizae layer. So, and then it's also, she's saying probably the system itself, like patients do get lost in the care. It's confusing. The system is confusing, whole insurance and referring, it's all confusing. And people just end up saying, I don't understand, I can't deal with it. It's a whole lot easier that way. And this story is, I'm telling you this because this is kind of the dark side of stories. This is where stories end up turning against people. This is how story works in the background in order to define who actually succeeds and who doesn't, who is with us and who's without. And you can actually see this in nature as well. You're looking at a black walnut. And one of the things about a black walnut is that it uses that mycorrhizae layer to actually, instead of sharing resources, it cuts resources off. Its strategy is to actually send messages through the layer to actually, and toxins, and to cut off the nutrients so that the trees around it that could possibly compete with it die, okay? They're not allowed nutrients and water. They're instead starved and they wither and die. So the reality is that everything's got a story in it. And if you want to change the world, you change the story. And that's going back to Sir Terry Pratchett. That's why the work that what Kiran's doing and other people are doing as far as the positive sides of story is so vitally important. And I really appreciate the opportunity to tell you my story. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Cecelia, for sharing some of your work with us there. Let's move ahead now to Danae Johnson, who works with us here at Texas Folklife as the program director of our Stories from Deep in the Heart program. This is one of my favorite initiatives that we do at Texas Folklife. I think we're always evolving it, and it's always changing a little bit. I understand it as sort of a media education and folklore training program. So we cover a lot of ground with it, and Danae has been the director of that program with us for about a year now. She's coordinated several initiatives and projects related to the Stories program. And so I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Danae. Thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Hi, Charlie. Glad to be here. Thanks for inviting me to the panel. Let me, I guess, introduce myself real quick, and then I'm also going to switch to a slideshow. As Charlie said, my name is Danae Johnson, and I've been working with Texas Folklife for about a year. And really agreeing with both premises already introduced, that stories matter, that stories come from the heart, stories deep in the heart, and that is where they're most powerful, depending on who's telling them and who's hearing them. And so out of that, I've continued work doing a Summer Institute program. It is an intensive workshop offered every summer through Texas Folklife, open to Texas educators, as well as nonprofit community members. And we take them through all the steps of creating their own radio story. So from the point of collecting their interview subject all the way through editing. And then as well as that, we work in some schools teaching that sort of training on a small level, whether it's an intro to podcasting, intro to editing, intro to interviewing. And then I would say that's 2 constituencies, teachers, students. And then the third one we're working with currently are veterans and military service members. And this is a new initiative Charlie started, I believe last year. We got a grant from the NEA, National Endowment for the Arts. So that's a third constituency that we're working with currently. And it is more on the education side, education, media education of how to tell a story or how to interview someone, or just some basic editing if you need that too. So that's just kind of important to know. More what I'm about to present is maybe more on the education side. What I did was made some really short PowerPoints, and now that I look at them, I realize this is kind of like, I'm here getting feedback from y'all, because I think the PowerPoints are really, what am I thinking about? And the team at Texas Folklife thinking about transitioning education to online, and what does it mean to go from in-person to virtual? So I think that's kind of my frame here, agreeing with all the before premises. So let me try to do the screen share real quick. And I'll talk through these slides. Okay, how does this look? Thumbs up? Okay, thank you. So yeah, just thinking about what is the old normal for us is the in-person workshop. This is a photo of us at the Texas Folklife Gallery last year doing the Summer Institute that I just mentioned. And actually there's folklorist, Dr. Rachel right there. And I think we had a class size of around 10 Austin educators, as well as some nonprofit members. And so that, you know, there's this new terminology already coming out right now. What is new normal? What is normal living under the pandemic? And for us, you know, the old normal is in-person workshops, one-on-one time, really not too much virtual at all. So now this is what I'm getting to is what is for Texas Folklife or the Stories program, what would it look like to be in this new normal era of what might be digital virtual learning? I guess in some ways I'm saying that we're already here maybe, and we need to figure out how much we can go forward with this digital virtual learning. Like for instance, we've never done Zoom before now. As Texas Folklife, we're all on Zoom now. We're getting used to the camera. We're getting used to what is netiquette. We're getting used to talking to each other through the internet. So this is kind of a new challenge in storytelling and being active in the virtual world. So I think this kind of goes back to definitely Cecilia's point, definitely Kiran's, like storytelling never stops, even during a pandemic, which we are in. And I think I just put this up here. Our daily lives have been impacted, you know, on the daily life, schools, work, grocery shopping, houses, chores, concerts, clubs, and politics. I mean, the list goes on. I think every facet of news is right now covering the virus in some way. So it's impacting all of these different subjects. And so there's a lot of fruit here, I guess, for stories. I'll say, like, I'm sure I've already either heard or read or listened to like hundreds of news stories of new and old stories, right? It's stories with a twist, these new things that are happening that are impacting all these facets of our daily lives. And so this photo, which kind of goes with these 3 points I have here, kind of illustrates this new thing in Austin that I'll talk about in a minute. So I think for me right now, during this time and getting ready for our Summer Institute, now is the time for us, and I think some other folks at Texas Folklife have already been doing this too. This is why Charlie, I think, put this, you know, helped put this panels together as well, is right now we're just really trying to pay attention. We're trying to listen to what our local networks are saying. We're reading newsletters. I'm on so many email newsletters, probably more than I want to be. I'm getting constant COVID updates, but I try to read them all, try to get through them, because everyone is at a different level of where they are, and just seeing where people are, because all of this information is going to kind of impact what stories we want to hear, or not maybe what we want to hear, but what stories are going to be out there, and what stories, you know, do we cover, and which ones are our constituents thinking about, you know. And I'm back to Texas Folklife, you know, those are teachers, educators, students, and then the military, the Texas military population. Another great place is social media. Listening and engagement, you know, you kind of have to curate who you are listening to. I know that's a big question and a big challenge of who do you listen to and when. Kind of going back to your work, Cecelia, you know, there's some choices there that have to be made. And then engagement. And then right now I'd say, like, we're pretty much in this period of like listening, engagement, like doing check-ins, trying to talk to people more often, more than ever maybe. And then I think the next step is like collection. Like, when do we want to record? When do we want to collect the stories that we're hearing? Do we want to do that? Is that going to endanger someone right now, or what they're feeling or going through? Is now not the right time? Is it the right time? You know, there's some maybe more positive ones that I can definitely say yes, but that's just a question on our mind and going forward. And then to explain this photo, does anyone know what this photo is? Give me a thumbs up if you have any idea what this is, except Charlie, because it's in Austin. Okay, so these are Austin school buses, and they're in a neighborhood, most likely in a low-income neighborhood. And what happened is Austin went virtual online 2 weeks ago. So all the students are learning online, or the majority of them, not all of them are. There are questions of equity. But in order to address equity, they retrofitted these buses with Wi-Fi and sent them out to neighborhoods. And so in this picture, you have so many stories, I think. You know, you have the story of the parents, whatever they're thinking about this whole operation, the story of the bus driver, the internet service providers, the school administrators. We're all trying to organize this whole thing. I haven't experienced it myself. I've just been following this story because, you know, going into the Summer Institute and working with educators, this might be something that comes up. This might be like a segment, a little piece of the story that we might want to pay attention to and record our own story about. That's what that photo is about. Okay, then one more slide. Okay, so this is kind of what I guess I'm, where I'm at right now in my mind. Like, we're only a month into this pandemic and shelter in place, and the kids are online now. And my question, is, are we going to go virtual for everything? Do we need to go to virtual to everything? Is it going to be some things, not everything? These are just things to think about. Like I said, so on the right, I kind of sneaked a photo of my coworkers and I for one of our first Zoom meetings, because now we used to have all our meetings in person, and now we're online, and we're trying to connect, as much as possible, because as long, with storytelling, there's always connection, there's always room for connection. And I just think, I was like, this is a great way that we're trying to connect during this time virtually, but also get our work done, of course. But I thought, we moved to Zoom pretty quickly. And so maybe for us, for Texas Folklife, this is something that we're already moving toward. We don't know what the parameters are yet, but it's something we're working through. And then this is something that will inform the Summer Institute and future workshops. Because going online is a challenge. You have to rewrite your curriculum. You have to think about access. You have to think about equity. You have to think about how you're going to collect the stories. What kind of, are you going to use a recorder? Are you going to use a cell phone? So that's kind of possibilities, wants, and needs. The possibilities being that there's a lot possible now, I think, with online learning and digital learning and collecting stories, where I actually see a lot of possibilities on social media, to be honest. And so that's why there's this third photo, or the second photo in the middle. I don't know if you can guess who that is. Does anyone have ideas? A politician? No one. Do y'all know who this is? No one? Okay, it's Bernie Sanders, and he is on Instagram Live with a rapper, Cardi B. And this happened last week, and they went online to 60 million people and to tell the story of whatever they want to talk about. I don't remember, I think they're talking about politics and the virus or something. So there's just these different ways of reaching people, and then there's different ways of storytelling. So that's just one possibility. And then wants and needs, we might want to push forward and get to virtual really quickly and now, but we also have to consider the needs of our audience and our constituents. So that's just something on our mind. And then I just wanted to leave with resources. If this is something you're interested in, being more virtual, being online virtual, I know in Texas, there are a lot of virtual trainings and webinars right now that are free. And I can provide a list after that, or maybe we can put it on our website with some free and some accessible trainings that you can do online. If this is something you're interested in. Like I said, this is still a conversation that I think we're all having. The schools have moved quickly to this, but they're already seeing problems there of equity and challenges. So I think this is like what I would love to just keep talking about, and what I think, you know, the Stories program is going to most likely be in this direction, at least, you know, for the time being. So I'm just throwing this out there as this is what we're thinking about, and this is maybe something to move forward on. Yeah, but that is kind of what I'm thinking about for this month. A lot of changes, you know, I never thought I'd be talking about this ever, virtual learning online. So this is where I'm at right now, and please feel free to reach me if you want to talk more, and we'll hopefully I can get some of those resources on our Texas Folklife website. My email is stories, STORIES @texasfolklife.org. Thank you, Charlie.
Great, thank you, Danae, for sharing that. You brought up some of the challenges that I would love for us to talk about as a group. We're going to switch now to Jane Field as our final presenter. Jane is the Associate Director at the Texas After Violence Project, and it's a community-based documentary project cultivating deeper understandings of the impacts of interpersonal and state-sanctioned violence on individuals, families, and communities. So Jane, I'll let you take it from here. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you. Am I unmuted successfully? Okay, good. Yeah, thank you for having me. So as you said, I work for the Texas After Violence Project, which is based here in Austin. And we do a lot of things, but a lot of our programs are built around what we've done from the start for over 10 years, which is conducting long-form life history interviews with people who have been impacted by the criminal justice system here in Texas. At the beginning, our interviews were primarily focused on documenting the impact of the death penalty specifically. So speaking with family members of people who had been executed, family members of people who had been murdered, and also other people within the legal system working in capital cases. So prosecutors, defense attorneys, jurors who had sentenced people to death, people who worked in prisons on death row, and anyone who, spiritual advisors to death row, media witnesses, anyone who'd been impacted. So we have a long history of conducting interviews in the wake of violence and conducting interviews with people who have been deeply traumatized by their experiences. And you know, one thing that we've found, and one thing that has been evident in the many interviews we've conducted over the years, is the fact that our criminal justice system is deeply traumatizing to everyone involved with it, even if they support and believe in the system. It often is traumatizing. So I think we have thought about this this question of interviewing and preserving difficult stories from people who are telling stories about their experiences that aren't necessarily easy to do. And we draw a lot on oral history methodology when we record interviews with people. So we really look at storytelling a bit differently. You know, I loved everything you said here, and it was so beautiful. And I really deeply value storytelling performances, although that's not really what we do. We conduct dialogues between two people who are sitting together and sharing a space. And part of our work is really to create a space where we can bear witness to another person's experience, and create a space with them where they can share their story in their own way, in their own words, and going off on as many tangents as they want or need to go on to tell their story until they feel it's been told completely. I wouldn't say completely, that's the wrong word, but until they're satisfied with what they've told. And that sometimes means going back and interviewing people multiple times. You know, we have interviews that are only 30 minutes long. We have others that last 8 hours over multiple interviewing sessions. So that's a really important part of what we do, is just making the space and the time for people to tell their story to a point of feeling some satisfaction with what they've told. So one thing that we've really learned over the years is when we're conducting interviews like this, and I think it is relevant. In a moment, I'll start talking about the documentation projects that we're doing around COVID-19. But one thing that we think about a lot, and we try to be very careful in our own work and in our conversations with people who are thinking about donating an interview to us, is the dangers of re-traumatization from telling your story again, and recognizing that not everyone is ready to tell a story when they're of something traumatic that's happened to them. And so we like to just have really open conversations as much as we can before we even get to that space of sitting down and interviewing someone, where they're going to be sharing their not just the story about one particular event in their life, but really the stories from their whole life that put that one moment that may be the most difficult moment of their life in the context of their full history. And so I wanted to mention that because I think as people get into telling stories about COVID and preserving those stories and documenting them in various ways, I think it's important to recognize that that's not safe for every person to do. And so, and then I also wanted to talk a little bit about some of the things we see when we conduct these interviews, and all of our interviews, we record with a video camera. So there's, it's not just the audio recording, but video recording as well. And I think people tell stories with their bodies just as much as they tell stories with their words. So I really love that we are able to record them using video as well. And then we preserve them after the interview has been conducted and after the person who gave the interview has had an opportunity to review it and is okay with making it public. We publish the stories in our online archive through the University of Texas Human Rights Documentation Initiative. So all of our interviews the videos and the transcripts are available online. So when we conduct an interview, there are certain things that we have seen happen throughout multiple interviews. And that's not to say that this is true of every interview, but we often see that there is some sort of healing that takes place. And I want to emphasize again, like, this isn't a therapeutic action that we're asking people to take. Many times people are telling their stories because they feel it's important for these stories to be preserved, and not because they are expecting any sort of healing to take place in themselves. But that being said, I think there is something for many people, not everyone, that is healing about the ability to share your own story in your own words, and to be able to share share a story that you know will be preserved in its entirety unless you request edits, rather than being edited down into a soundbite for the news, or adapted in another way to fit someone else's agenda. Another important aspect that I think it has is allowing someone, or offering someone, a sense of more control over one's own narrative. And that gets back to the ability to tell your own story in your own words. And again, it gets back to our willingness to sit there with someone and create that space with them for as long as it takes to get their story recorded. And I think that that's a really important aspect of moving through life in the aftermath of trauma in general, is really finding new ways to get a sense of control. And I also think that building narratives around really difficult topics and traumatic life experiences does help make meaning for many storytellers. And then it also allows us to record so much learning and wisdom from the people that we're interviewing about these difficult experiences, that can then be shared with other people who are maybe just starting out on similar experiences. We have done a number of interviews with family members of people on death row, and one thing that I think they share is a desire to help people who are just starting out navigating the system of capital punishment in Texas, and they talk about how confusing the experience was when they had a loved one who was first sentenced to death and first arrived on death row, and how they hope that they can share knowledge with other people that who might be going through that as well. So I think that ability, but it's also difficult for them. Sometimes it can be difficult to communicate with each other because there's so much stigma. So I think building that ability to communicate even when they're not in the presence of someone else is another really interesting aspect of the work we do. So as I've said, we document all aspects of the criminal justice system. And so in the past few weeks, we've really pivoted our work and shifted, and we are in the very early stages of creating a virtual interviewing project where we'll be interviewing formerly incarcerated people about their experiences of this pandemic. And really looking at topics that are more specific to them, including issues like PTSD that is triggered by being in social distancing and isolation, access or lack thereof to recovery support, lack of access to resources that are maybe more available to other people who don't have convictions on their records. So all of these things we'll be thinking about all of these things as we plan this project, and thinking about how to build a connection and engage with someone virtually over Zoom, which at first I was very hesitant about, but I think it actually could be a really valuable experience. And as we've talked about how it can be done, and the benefits, in fact, of conducting interviews over Zoom, it's likely it's something that we'll be continuing with in our work moving forward. Not entirely, but offering that as an option to someone who may not actually be able to do an interview if it were in person. So yes, I think I'm running, we're already going over the time limit. So I will end there, but I'd love to hear more from everyone who and the work that everyone is doing to document what's happening right now.
Great. Thank you, Jane, for sharing some of the work that you're doing. Yeah, thank you to all of our presenters for giving us a little taste of projects you've worked on. or what you're doing now. I guess I wanted to take a couple minutes here that we had for discussion, and touch on a few threads that were sort of common in all of your presentations. I guess the first one was I'd love to hear a little bit more about kind of the pivots in the work that you're undertaking now. You know, some of you mentioned this digital divide, and you know, at a time where kind of access to digital broadcast technology is one of the few ways that people can get a message out, can get a story out. If you don't have access to those technologies, you're not the training to utilize them. How can you get your message out? So I'm curious to know from some of you, what are things that we, as either people that are part of nonprofit organizations or people that work with stories or work with artists or work with tradition bearers, what can we be doing to help bridge the divide right now? Can we be providing training? Can we be helping people get access to equipment that they need? What are some examples of this that you've seen that you think are working? And what else are you doing to address that issue? So I'll put that to the group.
Okay, so Charlie, you're talking about, when you say digital divide, you're talking about like sorry, are you talking about political divides?
I'm talking about just access to technology,
access
to digital broadcast technologies, and
right.
what that means right now as like a real storytelling medium and broadcast medium.
Yeah, I was making notes as fellow panelists were speaking, and there was a lot that resonated and kind of reassured, and some of the approaches or things that I've been thinking of, and it was something that sort of Danae was talking about, and Jane, in the sense of enabling people to feel that their story, to do justice to the story. And that's really important. I don't like things like when you've squashed it into 3 minutes. I don't want elevator stories. I want to hear your full story. And I think that's really important to allow and to have those conversations that lead up to that moment and to enable. So I think in the digital space, I think about it, there's both opportunity and we think of storytelling as something that's sacred, right? And the sacred part is where when we have two individuals sharing something that we've done for thousands of years. But there's another type of new sacred that's happening right now in the digital realm, is that stories are coming. We can listen to someone's story and share a story in a way that's accessible without the middleman, in a sense that the stories that are coming to us, storytelling is inherently good, right? You share a story. Yes, it can be used as a force for good and evil, and I believe that. But when you share a story of your experience, it's inherently good. There's truth in all stories, as long as it holds truth and meaning to the teller. And so when we have an opportunity to listen to that and our personal stories in this realm of sharing, we're cutting out the big media stations in a way that becomes something that's very sacred between two individuals, to have a virtual dinner or build a relationship. The downside of it, there's a possibility that we're not going to allow our full vulnerability to be exposed in a digital space, because we can switch off anytime and we can present ourselves in a way that doesn't allow us to fully to share the full completeness of that story. But I think there's good and bad, there's benefits and pros and cons in that space. And going back to this idea of how we can empower people, how we can support people, I like to think about, the work that Cecelia is doing. And I love, can I just quickly say the mycelium? I love mushrooms. And in my cup is foraged mushrooms, turkey tail. I go foraging, so I'm a mushroom man. I drink turkey tail mushroom forage for healing. But just also this idea of ethnography. And I think as folklorists, as cultural practitioners that are trained in this, in ethnographic processes, one of the things that I really encourage people to do, even if they don't have digital equipment, like nurse practitioners I'm working with, and I say journal, 5-10 minutes every day. In a 100, 200 years from now, when we look back, they're not interested in the CNN story. They're interested in your stories, your journals. They don't have to have a story beginning, middle, and end. It's a process of making sense of the world. And through journaling, through this autoethnography, through the collecting our observations and our experiences, what's coming up for us, the story naturally emerges like permaculture. You know, what story's meant to be there will naturally come to the surface. And what we don't use can be used as compost for later. Pretty, blah, blah, blah. Thank you.
Hey, Charlie, Kiran, I really loved what you had to say. And I couldn't agree more. One of the things that kind of comes to my mind, and when I was doing my project, it was such a profound experience that a number of the mothers that I was talking to were so overwhelmed by the fact that somebody wanted to have their story, that they had an opportunity to tell their story, especially for a group that felt like they had been created, that an identity had been created for them through the othering story. They didn't feel like they were worthy of telling their story. And I think that's one of the things to have to pay attention to now in the digital space is that there are some people who are digital natives who are very adept at communicating through digital. Whereas there are some people who have not had access to it, you know, from the cradle, like some people have, and it's not something they're comfortable with. And they feel crowded out. They feel like that they can't get their voice forward. And I've heard that in a number of the people that I interviewed with. I think that was really, truly one of the most profound experiences of my project. And that's something I've encountered in other spheres. You know, in other experiences I've had, I've made sure that I curated talks to make sure that we didn't just have an expert talking about Houston's jazz culture, that we actually had performers doing their own discussions and performing, which is their way of communicating, right? As well as the teachers and people who had lived the history, because you have this wide 360 view and you allow everybody to be an expert, that the term expert doesn't just belong to one group. I think that's really important. There's a group called Storytellers out of Berkeley, University of Berkeley. And I don't know if my other panelists have heard of them before, but a colleague of mine from my program is a trained story center worker. And what she does is actually works with people through seminars that are 2 or 3 days where they have a story circle that is, you know, what's seen here is and said here is stays here. And people are encouraged to bring their stories forward, a lot like what Jane has been talking about. And then they're encouraged to actually learn some very simple digital tools to create their own story. And they're using WeVideo to do it. And it's a very powerful experience. And just like Kiran said, you've taken out the middleman.
Great, thank you for sharing that. You know, I think there are, Danae mentioned we're getting all these emails with different resources, but I try to grab the ones that I find helpful. And I know, you know, there's a number of organizations that are doing some good work right now. The Vermont Folklife Center is one that comes to mind. They're doing a project happening right now. I think it's called Listening in Place, and they're encouraging people to tell stories from where they are with their families or at home during this time. So I think that there's some pretty interesting examples out there. And like Kiran said, you know, years from now when historians are studying this period, we want to hear from the people. We want to hear community stories. We want to hear people's stories, not what's happening on the mainstream news necessarily. So we are collecting some of those resources and sharing some of those on Texas Folklife's page. So any of you or anyone listening that wants to give us some more ideas for places that are doing some cool work with collecting stories or creating a platform for people to tell their stories right now, we would welcome that. So give us a comment in the Facebook discussion, or panelists, you can contact me after. I wanted to, I don't want to keep you too long. We started a little late with some technical difficulties, but I wanted to ask another maybe related question. You know, with any kind of information and storytelling or news right now, people are often siloed in what they hear and what they pay attention to. they sort of seek affirmation of their views, not necessarily new information. So we're all kind of getting the information from certain streams, and we're comfortable in those streams, and it can be a real challenge to break out of those sometimes. So when we're providing storytelling platforms or opportunities for people to tell stories, we all have sort of agendas and who we want to hear these stories. So how do we do that? How do we make sure the people that we want to hear these stories hear them? How do we make sure that the voices that we want, Cecelia, to your point, how do we make sure the community experts can have that platform? So how do we encourage who we want to tell the story, and how do we encourage the listeners who we want to have pay attention?
Well, that's actually something I've been asking a lot about my project. And after I got done with my project, I started reaching out to different entities here in Houston about how it was that we could actually tell those stories. One of the things that was really interesting to me when I started researching about where health equity was being discussed in Houston, before I did my project, is that it was never being discussed with the communities that were being affected. It was only being discussed within academic circles behind closed doors or invited doctors. And that was utterly shocking to me. There's a quote from Gandhi that what's done for me but without me is done to me. And I think it's vitally important that the community be working with the people who have the expertise in order to create solutions. But then to actually get the doctors to sit down and actually listen to what these stories are, then it gets a little difficult. I had one doctor tell me that an anecdote is nothing but a story without any data attached to it, that she only wanted to hear the statistics and how it was that you could really change the statistics, and that the personal story wasn't effective for her. The other thing is that you have people that when they're in the medical field, their lives are 120% claimed. And yeah, I know that you can't have more than 100%, but they're actually giving that much. So they don't have the gap to sit and to do this. It's terrifying. One of the things that I've been looking at is a project called Troubling Violence that was done by Elaine Lawless in Missouri. And this was a couple decades ago. Have you heard of it, Charlie? Any of my other? Okay, I'm seeing some nods. I see Kiran. All right, Kiran. Absolutely fantastic. What Elaine Lawless did for her dissertation was she collected stories of women who were in domestic violence situations, who were had been involved in abuse. And she collected those stories, and then she connected with her partner. I forget what her name is, and I'm so embarrassed about this, but she was a performance professor at their college. And they found master's students within the program who actually performed those stories. And a couple of instances, they said, no, I'm not going to perform that story. I'm going to perform my own. And they actually brought those voices to life, and then they performed them in front of the groups. And it was a way that actually what I was trying to do was say that, there is an underlying story. And the more that you hear the personal stories, you can hear that undercurrent. You can hear that layer underneath there it's perking up that story. And those performances were incredibly effective. They were performed 36 times in Missouri. And I really think that that's a key to it.
I might speak to that a little bit. I was going to quote Elaine Lawless as well, but I was a big fan of. But I think it's this idea that the listener will always be the final person to interpret the story, and that can never really change. There will always be that person that interprets that final meaning message because they have to make meaning for it themselves. And so I think it's really about what the intention might be when you wanted to communicate. Now, for example, you have to think about the audience, who you appear. And I want to give an example. Last year, there was a vigil called Lights for Liberty. And this was to raise attention about the children that were on detention camps at the US-Mexico border. Now, it's something that I could not, I run a nonprofit organization. I get support from different people. But something personally said to me, I am the son of refugees. I am an immigrant. I could not say no to the opportunity to speak at this vigil, and they asked me to. But I realized that, I'm not speaking to the people that are near me at that vigil. I'm speaking to all the cameras and TV cameras and journalists, because I'm speaking to a community that are still on the fence. Now, I didn't tell them what to do, But what I did do is tell a story. And I shared a story of me as a 12-year-old first coming to this country and receiving, it was a story about a Chinese immigrant that took a photograph of me and my father on the top of the Statue of Liberty in the Crown so that we forgot our camera. And he sent it to us all the way in England, an act of kindness. And I continue that story about acts of kindness, about the kind woman that picked me up when I was 5 years old after being attacked by the neo-Nazi, that my mother told me that an elderly white woman picked me up and carried me home. And these acts of kindness that draws on values. And I said that the final message of that story is that all this stuff that we're thinking about on the US border right now is let's draw from our greatest superpower. And the superpower is our acts of kindness. And that's what makes this country what this country is. And so it's kind of this idea of using that, telling a story from your own experience and knowing that that final person is going to be the receiver and they're going to interpret that. So drawing from values that bind us. And what Lane Lawless talks about are these maps of our imagination. When I share a story and somebody listens to that story, it's like a speech bubble, right? Or a mind bubble. And eventually the stories begin to overlap. And in that overlapness is where we discover shared values, but it's also the space that we get to create values. And that's the place where we build empathy, understanding, connection. And that's the place in which we can move forward together. And it's the space that we're in right now, this liminal space that we're in right now in this moment, the storied moment.
That's really well said, Kiran. Thank you.
Okay.
I have sort of a final question. This one's for Danae and for Jane. This builds off of kind of some of the previous comments, and it's about finding balance. In the work that each of you do in different projects, you know, we're often looking for that storytelling as medicine that Kiran brought up. But how do we balance that with the danger of re-traumatizing people through storytelling? How does that work practically or on another level in the work that you do?
Well, I think you just, what our approach and is really to just move very slowly through the whole process and give people lots of opportunities to back out, including during the interview itself, deciding that it's just not right for them, it's not the right moment, and trying to make that option very accessible for people so that they don't feel bad, you know. And I think we are able to do that and make clear that that's an okay option because people have backed out, you know, the morning of. People have stopped during interviews and just said that they can't keep going. And you know, I'd always prefer for them to stop before the interview, to withdraw before the interview even begins, just because I don't want to put someone through even 10 minutes of an interview if it's going to be too much, too hard for them. But I think you can get a sense in conversation with people before an interview takes place, and just being really honest and open about what you'll be talking about and the topics that you'll cover. And we also give people we ask people to think about any topics that they don't want to talk about beforehand, and we give them the option to just completely take certain topics off the table, and we won't discuss those during the span of the interview. And so I don't think there's some magic solution that will protect you and protect the people you're interviewing from the possibility of re-traumatization. But I do think that there are steps that you can take to approach the whole process very gently, so that hopefully if feel unsafe or feel that that might be an outcome, they can step away from it before that happens. And so that's our approach. Just move very, very slowly and gently. And then again, really be careful after the interview as well, in the way we communicate the process and give people the option to eliminate parts of their interview if they edit out parts of their interview if they don't want them to be made public, or to never publish their interview if they decide after the fact that it's not something that they want to have public, and which I think can be traumatizing in its own way for some people. So I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah. Hello. I think that was a great answer. And similarly, like some practical things. This is more so, I think Charlie's talking to the veterans and military service member workshops we've done and are going to continue doing. But practically, facilitators, we have kind of like a guideline at the beginning, and we're just very clear about what's going to happen and what are the steps. And then as a facilitator, we ask the facilitators, including myself, to constantly check in and move on. And then kind of going back to the short PowerPoint I did, like for right now, I don't know what things, part of it's also being aware of what triggers there might be. And so like right now is a time to listen, to learn, through this pandemic, what kind of triggers there are. I could have already said something really stupid, who knows? I hope not, but we're already in that process of, figuring that out right now. And so just being aware of that, and then, your heart in the right place is good. But you do have to just be ready for that sort of thing to happen. And another step that we have is having a peer support specialist in the room. And that's something we'll probably continue to do because these things do come up. Even with best intentions, they come up, yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you. I know a lot of us like to talk and tell stories. We could be telling stories and talking all night if I let you guys stay on, but I think this is a good place to kind of wrap up our discussion. I wanted to thank you all for being here again. Danae, Cecelia, Kiran, and Jane, thank you so much for joining us. Appreciate your insight and sharing a bit about the work you've done and the work you're doing during this time.
Thank you. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much.
Absolutely. So we're going to be back next week here on Texas Folklife's page. If you are tuning in and you have a suggestion or there's a topic you're interested in seeing us kind of unpack related to folk and traditional arts in Texas, storytelling, other things that are happening during this time, some of the other programs that we work on and the issues that we deal with, please let us know. Please comment in here in Facebook. And if you're a panelist tonight, please send me some resources, anything you think that we should be looking at. And we want to use this as sort of an educational tool for people to get some ideas around various topics. So in this one, dealing with storytelling and the power of stories. So thank you all for joining us here. We'll be back next week. Hope everyone stays healthy, and it's great to see and talk to all of you.
Thank you.
Take
Good night,
care.
Charlie.
Thank you.